It gives me great pleasure to introduce the team from Franklin Templeton today. And they're going to be talking about their particular style of impact investment. Last year, Pensions for Purpose undertook some research into firms who are mapping portfolios to the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we found was that all the providers that we interviewed were able to map to listed equities. 3/4 of them were able to map to fixed income portfolios as well, but only 40% of the people who responded said that they had that capability in private assets. So I think what Franklin Templeton are going to be talking to us about will be particularly interesting with that statistic in mind. It was also interesting that different firms had different methodologies. Some took negative impact into account, others only focused on positive impact. Some excluded certain sustainable development goals, others included them all. So our conclusion from that research was that it is still an area that was very much under development, and that asset owners and advisors should be really grilling asset managers on their methodology when thinking about the SDG alignment of their portfolios. So today we're going to be hearing from John Levy, who is Director of Impact at Franklin Templeton. And I'm confident that you're going to leave today with a much better understanding as to how Franklin Templeton not only align their portfolios to specific sustainable development goals, but how they actually go about trying to intentionally achieve positive impact within their target SDG themes. So this is a discussion about how to turn the theory into practice. Just one point to mention before I hand over to John is that Franklin Templeton are actually thinking about a UK-only proposition for their social infrastructure strategy that we're going to be hearing about. And they would love to get our thoughts and feedback at the end. So just hold that thought as we go through. And if there's time at the end, then we'll come back and just sort of seek your views and thoughts on that. So John, it's my pleasure to hand over to you now for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'll try to get through my deck in about 15 minutes, I believe, and then hopefully from there we can have a really interactive discussion. I'm going to share my screen. Is it the correct screen? Do you see the full presentation? Yes. Okay, great. So as Karen, the nice segue there, turning theory into action is really the name of the presentation we want to go through today. It's so important because there's so much out there in terms of what is impact, how is it executed, what's the best practice, what's the theory, and we really wanted to tie that into, well, how do we actually execute that on the ground? And so hopefully you get at least a teaser or a flavor of how we do that. And we're going to keep an eye towards the lessons learned for all impact strategies, not just ours in social infrastructure. So we started off with the SDGs. We always start off with this slide because the SDGs are such a valuable tool for us on how we not only communicate what we're trying to do, but also how we matchmake with asset owners, with investment opportunities. It's really the world's biggest to-do list, as you all know. One of the things you'll see that we highlight in our process is that I think the investment world's doing a great job at starting to talk about alignment with the SDGs, but aligning with the SDGs is not enough in our opinion. We want to talk about how we're going to contribute to the each of these goals and really map how we do so. And so we're going to highlight that a bit as we go forward, but it's always so important to understand what are we talking about, and we always start with the Sustainable Development Goals. When we talk about impact, just to level set here, I know this is a very well-informed group, we're talking about the GINS definition of impact, investing intentionally for both a financial return and a positive return to society and the environment. And so for us, that's that small circle on the right side. Of course, it is inclusive of ESG practices, avoiding harm, but it's really talking about intentionally investing to create positive impact. This is a slide I want to spend a little bit of time on. There's so much concern, and rightfully so, about impact washing. Rainbow washing is a new term, greenwashing. And one of the ways we always want to get over that is in our strategy, we talk to investors about the three-dimensional efficient frontier. Modern portfolio theory, which was created about 70 years ago, talks about the relationship between financial risk and financial reward. Well, again, 70 years old, that's not modern anymore. We think the 21st century, all investments, whether they're aware of it or not, can be mapped on a three-dimensional frontier of financial risk, reward, and impact. This is such an important concept because for us, if you picture that return line, put a circle on that line, and that's what we need to provide our investors, a market rate return, just like non-impact strategies. Put another circle on the risk line. We need to be as short on that line as we possibly can, limit risk, just like any other investment strategy. With those two vectors locked in, our job as impact investors is to go as far on the third dimension as we can. That's such an important concept because that means there are things we cannot do. We cannot go in and promise we're going to convert every old building into a carbon neutral building. There's so many things we want to do that we can't, but there's so much more that can be done that isn't being done by existing investors. And we think by having this kind of open, transparent discussion about what can and can't be done, we hopefully eliminate or minimize the risk or fear of overpromising on impact. But how do we measure impact? You know, we know how to measure risk, we know how to measure return. What about that third dimension? Well, it's not as straightforward. One of the papers we wrote, I guess about 2 years ago now, was talked about the 5 building blocks of impact management. These are often seen as best practices in the space. It's not one number. We can't just look at all impact strategies and give them one score that's comparable because we're in different asset classes. We have different theories of change, but we can use best practices across the board to be as standardized as possible. We already mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to objectives. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the operating principles for impact management. This is a way, there's 9 principles on how we as impact managers should speak to impact, including a third-party verification, which we think was much needed, and we need even more of that in our space. So happy to talk about that as well. In our asset class of real estate, the certifications like BREEAM and LEED and Fitwell play a really important role as well in trying to understand the impact we have. Of course, they'd be different certifications, things like B Corporation status for private equity, etc. And then one thing that I want to spend a little bit of time on when we go through our process is the impact management project, which is highlighted what they call the 5 dimensions of impact. And that really is a methodology, as it says, on how we should speak to and analyze the impact of individual deals. And then finally, how do we report on it? Metrics. The point of this slide is to really show you that there's no one standard, that it's really the bringing together of many different building blocks, as we call them. So let's talk about a bit about our strategy and another really important piece to any impact asset manager. It's called a theory of change. And again, hopefully you're very familiar with this. To me, another word for it that's helpful is a logic model. We're not talking about feel good. We're talking about real good, which means you have to try to prove it. You have to use logic. You have to use research and data as much as you possibly can to prove that your investment and your actions are leading to better outcomes. The theory of change starts with the challenge. What's the problem? Then what are you doing about it? How are you contributing? And then finally, what is the outcome? How have things gotten better? So just to bring it to life a little bit, I won't read this aloud to you, but for us, the challenge is, urban growth is accelerating, more people in cities, and it's not inclusive growth. The carbon footprint of cities is growing, and this is a real problem. Let's skip over to outcomes. What are we trying to do through our investments? Honestly, at the high level, it's very broad. We're trying to create more sustainable and inclusive communities. This will be very, very specific outcomes for each individual asset, but at a portfolio level, it's very broad. The interesting part is the middle. And this is where we don't think the impact ecosystem is doing enough. We need to talk about how are we contributing, not how is our investment company or operating partner contributing, but how is our capital creating a better outcome? There's 5 kind of ways we see we can contribute. from the provision of long-term aligned capital. This is actually really critical to be a trusted partner with local governments, with healthcare operators, with universities, and to structure deals for the long term so that that's win-win, especially in social infrastructure, which is an underinvested asset class. Function enhancement, environmental upgrades, these are physical improvements to the buildings themselves. Purpose-driven development, when we have opportunities to actually create more social infrastructure, and I realize I skipped over what is social infrastructure. These are the real estate assets where social services are being provided. So purpose-driven development is when we can actually add more. And then stakeholder partnerships. How can we work with local communities, with beneficiaries, with operators of these buildings as well? So this is really important to focus on how our capital is creating a better outcome. Not that we've invested in an asset that is doing good, but how has our investment itself created impact? I mentioned the SDGs and how people speak just to alignment. For us, we integrate this throughout our entire process. So first, as an example, let's talk about SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. What does that mean? That's not actionable language. That's very vague. And it's because this was not built for the investment world. This was built by the UN for multiple parties across society. But they did create targets, which is level of detail beneath each SDG that has much more interesting and actionable language. So for us, increasing water use efficiency and ensuring freshwater supplies is the actionable thing or contribution we want to make. How do we do that? Well, we're going to install low flow toilets, aerators, motion sensing taps. That's our action. That's our contribution. But how do we know if it's done anything? Well, we measure the volume of water used before and after these improvements. And in a perfect world, we would even do some data analytics to try to identify, is the reduction in water because of fewer people using the building? Is it weather related, or is it truly because of the improvement we made? That's the dream scenario, when you have enough data to really analyze it and do kind of attribution analysis. And then finally, the SDGs actually have global indicators that the UN are responsible for reporting on. And so we want to make sure that our efforts tie back into those indicators. So this is how we really integrate it throughout our process. Quickly, it's so important for us as well to provide that market rate return. If we're not attractive to investors financially, then it takes more and more concessionary capital in order to scale solutions. We want our solutions to be scalable. We do so by providing, I'll go quickly through it, long-term stable cash flows, low correlation to GDP, good downside protection, essentially very attractive investments from a financial perspective. But on equal footing with that is the impact return of community and the environment. Some people ask if these two are at odds. I don't believe they are. In fact, I believe in a concept of impact alpha, where by focusing on community and the environment, we can actually uncover opportunities to outperform our peers. Another thing really quickly that's important, I want to get a bit into our IMM process here. Impact is not always fully integrated into an asset manager's process. Sometimes it's a separate step. For us, we include it every step of the way, and that's just really important in order to prove that intentionality. We source deals solely looking for impactful investments. We diligence them that way, we report that way, etc. So maybe it's an obvious point, but it's actually not always how it's done. So how do we try to quantify impact in our process? Here, this looks like a complicated slide, but essentially we, again, wanted to be as transparent and authentic about our impact as we could be. So if there was already a high-performing hospital, for instance, we don't want to take credit that it's high-performing. So we created a scoring system that looks at the community value, for instance, at time of acquisition, which you see here is a 2, which would be an underperforming. And then we build a business plan over the holding period to identify and project where we think we can get the asset. So we essentially create a goal for ourselves using a repeatable scoring system. That way we can really focus in on what did we do, what role did we play in making a better outcome for community. Very same thing on the environmental side. And again, that's really important. It's complex, but as we've just done our second annual report, and the outcome from this scoring system has worked really well in helping us communicate how our investors' capital has contributed to each of these assets. Factors, very important here. The environmental side is difficult, but well understood and intuitive. Luckily for us, we're not trailblazers when it comes to thinking about how to measure the environmental footprint of a building. There are standards like BREEAM, like GRESB out there. And so we've actually built a scoring system that very much takes best practices from those standards, measuring pollution, energy use, etc. But the community side, there was no one to copy or emulate that we could see for our exact strategy. So we came up with 5 factors. I want to just bring one to life for you really quickly here. Community purpose, essentiality, and quality. Imagine 2 health clinics. One has cosmetic plastic surgery, the other does cancer screening. The cosmetic plastic surgery, that's not truly what we're looking for. That score is a 0, but cancer screening is a 5 from a purpose perspective. But how essential is it? What if there are 5 clinics in the neighborhood? You can get an appointment tomorrow. The technology is fine. Then it's not essential. Conversely, what if it's the only clinic in that neighborhood, in that community? Then it becomes highly critical that it function well. And then quality of service, of course, means different things for different assets, but we do our best to understand the quality of care, the quality of the housing, the healthcare, the education, etc. And so we don't have time to go through the other 4, but we have 5 of these more bespoke ways of looking at the community from a scoring perspective. Last thing on the framework, and then I'd like to bring this to life with one example, and then we can hand it over to Alex to facilitate some questions. Maybe I'll go quickly through this. It really all comes together. You'll see those SDG targets at the top. You see those 5 symbols. Those are the 5 dimensions of impact, and happy to talk more about the impact management project's 5 dimensions. You see at the bottom our scoring system, our contribution symbols as well. This all comes together with every asset on very, very robust reporting and updating of these reports so that we can really understand impact from all angles if possible. And then finally, hopefully I'm doing okay on time here. I wanted to bring it to life with one quick example. It's not too quick because it's actually really interesting, but you look at the picture on the top here. It's not a high quality picture, but this is this beautiful asset. It's a nursing home and research hospital on Lido Island in Italy. What happened here is, I'll go to the next slide here. You see the same challenge, contribution, outcome. It's that same theory of change. One of the things we wanted to do is try to preserve the asset. The problem was this asset was going to close, and the operators were struggling financially, and the initial bidders wanted to convert this to a high-end hotel and or residential. You saw the picture. It makes perfect sense that they would want to do that. The problem is this is one of only a few healthcare assets and hospitals in the area. It provides good jobs that aren't tourism based. And so it was really critical for the community. And this is how we found out about the asset and were able to come in and purchase it with the hopes of preserving it. We were able to structure new deals with new operators, and again, preserve these services for the community, and also importantly, preserve these jobs for the local community as well. So that's how we preserve the asset. That wasn't enough. We also want to improve. These buildings are very, very old. And so as part of the deal, we made sure to include that there'd be $6 million putting into improving the physical quality of these assets, both the nursing home and the research hospital. That refurbishment is just getting started now, but there has been new gardens put into place and a lot of things are starting to build. So we're going to see better quality of the asset over time. Also, the services in the nursing home, I was able to go visit this asset before we acquired it, and the quality of service very poor. We were able to visit the new operator, and I could go on and on about the story, but you can see night and day the difference in terms of the quality for the patients there. And so we were able to really bring in a new high quality operator. And also the research facility is growing in rank and reputation and is becoming a really a source of pride for the region. And then expand. There's huge need for more nursing home and these types of hospital beds as well. And so we're working with the operators to expand. We want to construct a new end-of-life care facility. You see this beat up building overlooking the lake there on the bottom left. We're going to try to convert that into a dedicated end-of-life care facility, increasing supply in an undersupplied part of Italy. And then very quickly, accessibility, really, really hard to get here. We were able to work with the local municipality to get more direct water bus service to the asset, cutting commute times for visitors and employees from 2 hours to 1 hour. So that helps with access, which we really focus on. And then as well, this has been really well documented in Italy, and they really are happy that we came in and preserved the asset. And this has given us opportunities to work with operators in the region, including one that's on our pipeline now, which would be a new dedicated contagious disease wing at a hospital on the mainland there. So just wanted to bring to life for impact an example of how we were able to preserve, improve, and expand an asset. With that, I think I will stop talking and hand it over to Alex, and hopefully we can have a good conversation.